All right, it's Friday again. Welcome to the Security Weekly News wrap-up for the week of 4 October 2020. Stuxnet Redux, Fancy Bear, HP printers, UEFI Bootkits, EGregor, and locked up naughty bits. All this and more on Security Weekly News wrap-up.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
It's the show that keeps you up to date on the latest security news twice a week, your trusted source for accurate security information and expert analysis. It's time for Security Weekly News. Do you know where your organization's crown jewel data is, whose data it is, what it contains, and if it's flagged, tagged, and classified accurately? Defense in Depth requires discovery in depth. At Big ID, they help organizations uncover dark data, classify sensitive and regulated data, meet compliance requirements, and take action for data on-prem, in the cloud, and everywhere in between. Learn more about how Discovery in Depth can change the way enterprise organizations find, classify, and protect sensitive data at securityweekly.com/Big ID. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
All right, I'm Doug White from Roger Williams University, your host, and welcome to the Security Weekly News wrap-up show. Let's wrap up all the show topics for the week. On Application Security Weekly number 124, Mike, Matt, and John had Chris Romeo, the CEO of Security Journey, and he was on to talk about things every developer must know about security, and talks about practicing developer empathy. Yeah, I have no empathy. When I was a developer, I had no empathy for anybody else. And when I wasn't a developer, I had no empathy for developers. I think I just don't have any empathy. That's probably what the problem is. So, you might want to check that segment out. It's not a bad idea. We were talking about that last night about the engineering idea and developers needing to include security people on their team. So maybe this can help the security people try to get a little more empathy towards the poor developers. Yeah. All right. On Business Security Weekly number 190, Paul, Jason, and Matt talked with Parham Eftekhari. He's the Senior VP and Executive Director of the Cybersecurity Collaborative. And he was on to talk about what that is and why the nation's top CISOs are rediscovering peer-to-peer collaboration. When I first saw that, I was like peer-to-peer, but then I saw collaboration. So not that kind of peer-to-peer, but it's like actually I think in how do you collaborate with each other. In a second segment, they talked about metrics and 5 simple ways to make better decisions. I probably need that because I tend to make the wrong decisions a lot. But don't watch the show last night. Yeah, I made some wrong decisions. On Enterprise Security Weekly number 200, an auspicious number, Matt and Paul had Chris Neckar, the CISO of Spring Labs, and the discussion was about least privilege, something that everybody's quite interested in these days, and how the appearance of safety and actual security often do not align as closely as we would like to think, and what are some of the risks associated with common classes of security products. On the last segment on that show, Jen Ayers, the Vice President of Falcon Overwatch, was on to talk about, Falcon Overwatch. If you're not familiar with that, which you probably are, that's the elite team of threat hunters at CrowdStrike. On the Security Weekly News, number 71, Jason Wood talked about the OFAC fines, which was something I got all sort of bent out of shape about. And he did too, and how you could literally receive, I'm going to talk about this story later again, but how you could literally receive a penalty for paying a ransom or, and this was the part that really bugged me, advising a client to pay a ransom if the money happens to go to the wrong people. That was an interesting story this week to me. On Security and Compliance Weekly number 46, Jeff, John, Josh, and Scott had their first anniversary show. Can you believe it's already been a year since they started doing Security Compliance Weekly, but it has. Kat Valentine joined them. Kat's a consultant at Osmosis Security and always a fun person to have on. The first segment was with the crew talking about their favorite episodes from the year, and the second segment on there, they talked about how security and compliance fails and what to do about it. So, definitely two good segments. As usual on this show, congratulations to everybody on Security and Compliance Weekly for having such a successful year on a new show and growing that audience significantly. But I guess if you do a good show, your audience will grow. So, why not? On Paul's Security Weekly number 669 last night, the first segment had Alexander Krichanovsky. He's the CEO of Tempesta, and he was talking about and demoing, which was cool. He demoed Tempesta FW, which is an open source, and this, that's always exciting, hybrid of an HTTPS accelerator and a firewall. It was really cool, and it's open source. So if you're looking for things like that, the product is available on GitHub. It was quite interesting. Go watch that segment if you want to see him demo that and show you how effective it was. Tony Puntoriero was the community manager at Offensive Security. He joined everybody to talk about building your home lab for InfoSec and his links for his OSCP prep guides and other things. It was a lot of fun being on that segment because I think everybody there had built a lot of labs, and so Tony was sort of bringing up topics, and everybody was jumping in on it because we've all built tons of stuff at our houses and our school labs or whatever, and so I think all of us had a lot to say about this. It didn't get too sappy historical, so it's definitely a good segment for you to check out. I think that segment could have gone on for 3 or 4 hours without really much effort, because all of us had such an interest in that and continue to have such an interest in that. And of course, the news segment, be sure and watch that one to the end. It got a little interesting there later on. My favorite thread of the week is probably, it's going to come from last night. We were talking about a story about UEFI, and I was going to talk about the OFAC, or however, I don't know if you say OFAC, OFAC. It's a government agency in the Treasury Department. But basically, I decided I was going to talk about UEFI, and Jason really did it justice on Tuesday, so you can go watch that in the archive. But I think what got me on this one was this was a story for once, and I saw the story, and it was literally something I had not thought about very much. And it was the story's basically about how UEFI could be a very large threat surface to your systems. And I immediately, was just like, in my head was going, oh, wow. And then I got some emails during the show by other people saying, what about this and what about this? And so this kind of thing is called a bootkit. And it was kind of an urban legend, sort of a holy grail kind of thing a long time ago, where people were talking about embedding bootkits in chips. And of course, that was back in the days when your firmware was, soldered and desoldered on the motherboard. But basically, this bootkit that they're talking about is an infection of the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. And I did have to learn what that acronym meant, because if you teach freshman hardware classes and you say things like UEFI, someone almost always goes, excuse me, what does that stand for? And I never knew if they really cared, or they were just trying to see if you actually knew what it stood for. And you hate to make up something to see if they really know, like, the Undercam Expansion First Interaction System or something, and then, watch them all write that down in the notes. But sorry, freshmen. But now this hasn't happened much. So there have been only 2 known cases of this. One was this LoJack thing from some years ago. But if there's the point of the story, I think, and the point of us bringing this up and talking about it so much, was that if there's a listener in your UEFI, well, that would be bad, right? I mean, not just bad firmware, but now the capability to actually do something to the firmware on the fly really got me thinking about that. And Tyler had his, Tyler knows something face going on. And I just really hadn't thought about it much before at that level, because it just seems like such an esoteric thing. And it's only happened twice. But Tyler started talking about the TCP/IP stack in the UEFI, and I was thinking, wow, my system has a TCP/IP stack in the UEFI, because if you go into that BIOS mode, you can connect to the internet, download updates, all from the UEFI. So you never boot the operating system. So the stack that you're using has to be on the disk somewhere. And I was wondering, is this thing sitting around? Is it out there listening? And then Tyler kind of winked and said UP&P, and I was like, oh, wake on LAN. So you start thinking about, well, that thing must be listening because the system you can have it wake up. You can actually wake up systems remotely with UP&P and other protocols. So the stack must be there listening. And, since it's a full stack, it could go out on the internet with an IP address and update firmware in the BIOS. It's very convenient, but it also means that the stack is sitting around all the time somewhere. And so this attack module was found by Kaspersky, and they named it, or somebody named it, Mosaic Regressor. And they said it appeared to be based on a hacking team UEFI rootkit, which was stolen 5 years ago. And they said that it looked like this UEFI bootkit that they found, this Mosaic Regressor, was developed by a Chinese actor. So I don't know how they determined that, but I guess based on the language in it and so forth. Now, I don't think you need to run out and start trying to wipe your firmware BIOS. Please don't do that, or that you could do it. But you should probably start thinking about this. And this may certainly be one of those things that emerges as a threat. And if those stacks can phone home, wake on LAN could trigger them. A bot could trigger them somehow. And if that could actually happen, I guess somebody could corrupt the firmware remotely. I mean, all that's a little bit of a stretch, but just hang in there with it, and it's a little bit scary. And now all the news, beyond my ranting. I always have to rant about something. It's been 10 years since Stuxnet, and this article was sort of celebrating the 10 years Stuxnet decade ago anniversary. And the article is about, is your OT safe? And we talked about this last night on Security Weekly as well. And my sort of take on it is that not only is your OT not safe, your OT is less safe than it used to be. So Stuxnet was this very defining moment for OT, because for pretty much all my career, I had heard this stuff where people said OT is safe because the Purdue model, puts a DMZ in between that and the IT part of the company. And the OT stuff is so proprietary. I heard that a bunch of times. Who would even know how it works? It's so obscure and it's not connected. So all those were pieces of this sort of stupid security through obscurity thing that you by now know I don't like very much. And I heard that over and over again. It's proprietary. It's not connected. It's too weird. Nobody would ever figure it out. Only weird nerds like you, Doug, would be worried about this. But now I don't think that is true any longer. Stuxnet made that change because somebody attacked an OT system. Now, it wasn't connected, so they had to attack it with, physical compromise, but they attacked it. And so as we keep adding IoT and IIoT into the OT, and IT sides of the industrial model, that DMZ firewall between OT and IT is starting to look a bit frayed. This idea that I've got something sitting here, but every day I'm having to punch more holes in it because I need to put a hole in it so that this camera system can access the controller or the historian or however it's going to access. And as we keep adding those pieces to it, the Purdue model starts to look a little scary right about that at that point. But this article goes on to talk about new 0 days that were found in this same system, which were tied to the original Stuxnet system. And you need to remember that ICS type stuff and OT stuff is often designed for that 25 to 50 year operational life. So it's maybe time to start looking at your OT closely for things you're adding to it or how you're modifying it. And maybe you could have some problems like this as you connect this back to the wider world. One of the first steps in a lot of ransomware frameworks is to delete the shadow copies. So a rollback won't help you, right? I mean, if they get rid of your shadow copies, you say, I'm just going to roll back to before this got installed. And we've all done that. We put a driver in or something where things went south, go to a rollback, go, phew, I'm glad they put this in. To do this operation, Windows uses a system tool called vssadmin.exe or wmic.exe. These are two special tools that are used by the system to move around, delete, and create shadow copies. Well, Florian Roth and Ollie Whitehouse released a tool called Raxine, which basically disables those tools until you manually re-enable them because they're really hard to disable. if you've ever started fooling with them. And it's also easy to screw stuff up on your system with that. But they posted this tool in their GitHub so you can test it out. And the point of it being that if all this ransomware and these ransomware frameworks actually start their day by attempting to manipulate the shadow copies, it might be the case that if we interrupt that process, it may actually interrupt the ransomware itself and or protect these shadow copies on the drive from being encrypted or deleted. And you can't really encrypt them very easily, but you can delete them. And I was thinking, well, it might actually keep the ransomware from executing. It depends on how resilient their code is, right? So if it tries to do this old-fashioned code, tries to do a step, and they don't use try-catch blocks or whatever, and it just fails, it may just fail right there. If it's try-catched and all these kind of nice modern approaches to building better code, then when that fails, it may skip over that step and still ransomware you, but you might actually be able to roll back if you could. So it's definitely something to take a look at. A new botnet called HEH basically bricks your IoT devices. Again, we talked about this on the show last night. This botnet goes looking for open port 23 and 2323 on the internet, so Shodan type scans, and then the bot attempts to brute force the device. So these are usually IoT devices that are doing this that people have foolishly pointed out onto the internet. Qihoo is the Qihoo's company's NetLab, which is a security wing of Qihoo, found the bots, and they started examining and reverse engineering them. The bot itself doesn't do very much, but it just sits there. So if it finds a vulnerable device, it then tries to do peer-to-peer connection, actual peer-to-peer connections, not like those peer-to-peer empathies or peer-to-peer collaborations we were talking about earlier, but the P2P connections, and then basically it brute forces its way onto another device. So it spreads kind of like a worm, and it just sits there. But if a certain command is received on one of these ports, it basically starts trying to wipe the various disks on these IoT devices using shell commands. So essentially what would happen is at the end of the day, it would brick your IoT. So nobody seems to have any opinion on what the purpose of this botnet is at this point. Is it something that is a precursor to an attack? Is it a distraction? Is it just somebody trying to prove that all these IoT devices are horribly vulnerable to things like this? Because it could do a lot more, right, if it's compromised. My answer to that would probably be all of the above, that any of these things may well be the ultimate objective of this, but they're reporting on it. I do think we were talking about this last night, I do think it's good that someone is sort of disclosing this, but as we said, the CFAA may mean this is illegal. So if you're running botnets that probe people's devices, Shodan, and you find them, and you can get in a whole lot of trouble. So trying to make a point is always a good thing, but it can be very dangerous if it's equipment you don't own. So if you need to make a point about this, go buy the IoT, put it in your network, and then you can do whatever you want to it. Don't come after other people's networks with that. New info points to GRU, which is the Russian military intelligence agency, as the attacker that was behind a recent U.S. federal agency attack. So CISA published an advisory last week that an agency, which they did not disclose, had been compromised, but they did not identify the attacker or the agency. The report did, however, give a bunch of details about the methods and the malware that was actually used to steal the target's data. And Dragos researchers who were looking for clues and an FBI notification that came out appear that it points to Fancy Bear, which is also called APT28. So this is a function, or at least reputedly a function of the GRU. And they basically pieced this together using detective work to say they think the attack on the agency was Fancy Bear. The article does provide all the clues they examined, so it is kind of a fun read if you're interested in such detective-type hijinks, so you could definitely check that out. HP expanded their bug bounty program to printer cartridges this week. It may be another thing you never thought about, but HP has been putting RFID and chips, like live chips, in cartridges for a while, and they've recently expanded this into their Soho printers. So now your home printer may well have RFID or an active chip in your printer cartridge. The cartridges then keep up with their state. They also know that they can track the number of uses. HP has a big program around subscribing to ink. So instead of you buying ink cartridges, you just subscribe and you say, I will print less than 5,000 copies in a quarter, and they will replace your ink. If you go over, you have to pay penalties and whatever. But if all that exists, then these things could be queried, then they could also be a threat. The printers themselves are smart devices. They're often running Windows, it appears. They have web servers on them. They have all kinds of stuff, so if you're sharing that out onto the world. But they do connect HP. And you can obviously block that and they'll still work, but they do try to phone home pretty regularly. So all of that, including the cartridge, just became an attack surface. Now, printers have been an attack surface for a long time, but it did kind of make me want to go drag my old LaserJet 2 serial printer out of the basement and plug that baby in if I could find something that had a serial port on it. But to be fair, this is great to see. I'm a huge fan of bug bounties. A lot of us are. And that helps to vet these new approaches because I don't want to be a Luddite about it and say, yeah, I stick with my LaserJet 2 because it doesn't have any security flaws. I would really like to have a new printer. So, I'm glad to see them putting bug bounties out on all this stuff so that it can get vetted. And I did want to mention the OFAC statement that Jason did talk about. But basically, the Office of Foreign Asset Control manages the process of enforcing financial sanctions for the United States government. So they announced that they could issue penalties. And this was already there. So it wasn't a revelation or like they did something new and horrible. It's always been there. But the point is that I didn't know about it. And a lot of people don't know about it. So I've been really sort of beating a drum about this issue. They can issue penalties of up to $20 million US for paying ransoms if the ransoms are paid to individuals who are on their sanctioned lists. So that means, all the bad guy countries as we define them, North Korea, Iran, on and on, and China, and on and on and on, and groups within those countries. So if you pay a ransom and the money gets transferred to, Fancy Bear, they can hit you with a bunch of fines. Now, the statement also mentioned that even recommending that someone pay a ransom, so as a consultant or an internal employee, they could hit you with penalties as well, which yikes. The defense of all this was that most insurance companies and big companies already have representation at OFAC, and they get release forms and all this stuff, so they get special dispensation if they need to authorize payment of a ransom. But it basically means if you don't have a full-time attorney on retainer that can run over to the OFAC building and get you a special exemption form, be really careful about payment and so on. So if you think you might get ransomware, I doubt this is a fast process to get this approval. So if your timer's running and they're going to wipe your drives in 4 days, and you don't have a lawyer on retainer over there, it could be a problem. And the rule is a strict liability, which means they don't really have to prove much of anything. And you can't claim that you had no idea that Fluffy Kitty was a front for the North Koreans and you just paid them. So they could conceivably do that. I'm not sure how they know that you're paying, unless you announce it. So if you just bought some Bitcoin and paid somebody some Bitcoin, I don't know that they would ever know you did that. But I guess if there's a big press release saying Doug White recommends that client pay ransom and ransom was paid to, Static Kitten or something, then yikes, they could come after you with a fine. EGregor is a new, kinder, gentler ransomware. Apparently, the framework exfiltrates your files, encrypts you, and then if you pay up, they will provide you with an analysis of your files and give you some guidance on how to better prevent ransomware in the future. It's kinder and gentler. 2 flaws in the Azure App Services, which is the app web hosting component of Azure. App Services is an HTTP-based service which allows you to host web apps and can be run in the cloud, or it can be run on your own local server cloud if you're using one of their appliances. Both of these flaws have fixes posted by Microsoft, and they're both related to Q2Lite. And Q2Lite is a third-party tool that is being used in Azure. And so the first part of this bug, which is these are open source components. So basically the first problem was that Q2Lite has hard-coded and known credentials. So root Docker with an exclamation point, because the exclamation point makes it secure. The other flaw is the Q2Lite API can actually receive requests without validating those requests. So that means people could chain these two things together to basically get remote code execution on Azure app services, which would be really bad. The article I attached to the wiki has a lot of detail about this vulnerability, so if that's something you're using or doing, you may want to check that out and make sure you've read up on those fixes. And finally, not to make light of anyone or kink shame anything. I don't want to do that. My personal philosophy is consenting adults may do anything they want with each other on their own, and it's fine. I have no problem with it. But look, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth-enabled sex toys are a big business, apparently. A big, insecure business. We talked about this a lot more raucously on PSW last night toward the end, but basically this story is about a male chastity device which is made in China, and it is called the Cellmate. And it's all fun and games until you find out it can be hacked and essentially bricked, which is to say locked on your, naughty bits and then bricked so you can't unlock it. It like doesn't have a key or anything. It has to be unlocked with, somebody's cell phone, and like it's been hacked and now it doesn't work anymore. Okay, so now your naughty bits are locked up and no amount of rebooting is going to work. The manufacturer did put out a very interesting, which I didn't put a link to, but you could get it out of the article, a small video showing how to try to break the device open with a screwdriver. And the company said it was far safer to use this than traditional devices where you could lose the key. Now, having dropped the key to a building I was working in down a drain pipe one time, I would guess that's pretty scary too. If you've got stuff locked onto you and this is you've got handcuffs and everything like that. Drop the key down the drain pipe and so it's a trip to the ER, jaws of life. You probably don't want to think about that kind of stuff considering what this device is used for. So you maybe want to pen test your sex toys before you take them out in public, because they are detectable, and that means other people may be actually working actively to do something to them. And that's the news wrap-up for the week of 4 October 2020 in the time of plague. I'm Doug White from Roger Williams University. I will see you next week on the network that never sleeps, Security Weekly. Be sure to vote.